The children did not die from the first volley of bullets. The forensic analysis of their bones, recovered from a field in the Ural Mountains 73 years after the execution, confirmed it. They were struck by rifle butts, stabbed with bayonets, and left to die in a cellar while the killers argued about what to do next. You know the official story. This is what the documents they never released actually show. July 17, 1918, 1:30 in the morning, Yekaterinburg, Russia. A man named Yakov Yurovsky walked into a cellar room in the basement of the Ipatiev House and told a family of 7 to get dressed. He said it was for their safety, that they were being moved. The family dressed quietly. Nicholas II carried his son Alexei, 13 years old, because the boy could not walk. His 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, followed their mother Alexandra into the room. The family physician, Eugene Botkin, came with them. So did 3 servants. 11 people walked into that cellar. None of them walked out. Yurovsky had been given a written order. The Romanov family was to be executed before anti-Bolshevik forces, the White Army, could reach the city and liberate them. The order was direct. The method was not. What happened in that basement over the next 20 minutes is something the Soviet Union spent 73 years trying to suppress. The Yurovsky Note, his own written account produced years later, describes a quick, efficient execution, a single volley, controlled, professional. The note was treated as the definitive record for decades. Soviet historians cited it. Western researchers built timelines around it. The bones told a different story. Here is the detail that almost no treatment of this story ever explains properly. In the months before the execution, Empress Alexandra had been sewing. She and her daughters spent those final weeks of captivity concealing their most valuable possessions, diamonds, pearls, precious stones, inside the linings of their clothing, their corsets specifically. The stones were not merely hidden, they were packed densely enough that the garments functioned, unintentionally, as crude ballistic protection. When the executioners fired the first volley at close range inside that cellar, the bullets struck the girls and deflected or failed to penetrate. 3 of the 4 daughters, and likely Alexei as well, were still alive after the first volley. The forensic analysis of the skeletal remains, conducted by Russian and American scientists in the early 1990s, confirmed multiple impact injuries inconsistent with gunshot wounds alone. Blunt force trauma to the skull, bayonet wounds. These injuries were not mentioned in the Yurovsky Note. They were not mentioned because acknowledging them would have transformed the official narrative of a controlled military execution into something far more difficult to defend. What nobody reported at the time, when the smoke cleared from the first volley and the executioners realized the children were still moving, what followed was not a second firing of guns. They ran out of room. The cellar was small. The smoke was thick. The men were panicking. And the doctor, Eugene Botkin, was still alive and watching. What do you do when the bullets don't work, when the execution you planned for minutes has already stretched past 10? Yurovsky Note skips over this entirely. The bones don't. Eugene Botkin had been the personal physician to the Romanov family since 1908. When Nicholas II abdicated the throne in March 1917, Botkin had a choice. He could have left. His position was now meaningless. His salary stopped. The family was under arrest. He stayed. He followed the family from palace to palace as the Bolsheviks moved them further east, first Tobolsk, then Yekaterinburg. He treated the children's illnesses. He managed Alexei's hemophilia. In the weeks before the execution, Botkin wrote a letter he knew he would never be able to send. It was found decades later. In it, he wrote that he had made his peace, that remaining with the family was a spiritual decision, not a professional one. He was 53 years old on the night of July 17th. The forensic report identifies his skeletal remains by dental records. He was shot. The manner of death is listed as consistent with the first volley. He was the only adult male in the room who did not have a weapon. The title of this video is not metaphor. Accounts of the execution, gathered from participants and later compiled by the investigator Nikolai Sokolov, who documented the case before the Bolsheviks could destroy the evidence, include testimony that the Tsar's children were beaten with rifle butts when the first volley failed. Sokolov's investigation, conducted in 1919, produced a report that ran to hundreds of pages. The Soviet government spent the next 70 years denying its conclusions. The White Army reached Yekaterinburg 8 days after the execution. What they found, and what Sokolov documented, is the reason the Soviet state buried this story for 3/4 of a century. Disposing of 11 bodies in 1918 Russia in mid-summer with White Army forces 2 days away was not simple. Yurovsky and his men loaded the bodies onto a truck. They drove into the forest outside Yekaterinburg to a mine shaft near a place called Ganina Yama. They tried to destroy the bodies there, using grenades, then fire, then sulfuric acid. It did not work. Over the next 3 days, Yurovsky's team moved the bodies twice. They burned 2 of them, later confirmed as Alexei and one of his sisters, most likely Maria, separately in a different location. The remaining 9 were buried together in a shallow pit, covered with railway sleepers, and left. The decision to bury them separately was deliberate. Yurovsky calculated that investigators would assume all 11 were in one location. If they found 9, they might conclude 2 had escaped. It was, forensically speaking, a significant miscalculation. When the bodies were eventually discovered, all of them in 2 separate locations, the separation of the remains became one of the most important pieces of evidence in confirming the completeness of the killing. You cannot stage a survivor if all the bones are accounted for. What the acid and fire failed to destroy entirely were teeth. Dental records, stored in St. Petersburg, cross-referenced 73 years later. If you're finding this valuable, a subscription helps the channel stay independent. There's a lot more in the second half, including the discovery that the Soviet government kept secret for 13 years. In 1976, a geologist named Alexander Avdonin found the burial pit. He found it by following Yurovsky's own account. A version of the Yurovsky Note had been circulating in restricted Soviet academic circles, and Avdonin had obtained access to it. He worked the geography. He excavated, carefully, by hand. He found 9 sets of remains in a shallow grave off a dirt road in the Ural forest, and he reburied them. And he told no one. Not because he was indifferent, because he was afraid. The Soviet Union was not a place where a private citizen announced that he had located the bodies of the last Tsar. Avdonin covered the site and spent 13 years waiting for a moment when it would be safe to speak. That moment came in 1989. The Soviet Union was beginning to fracture. Gorbachev's reforms had created a window. Avdonin went to the authorities. The official excavation began in 1991. Russian and American forensic scientists worked together on the analysis, the first such joint effort of its kind. DNA samples were taken from living relatives of the Romanov family, including Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose maternal grandmother was a sister of Empress Alexandra. The DNA matched. 9 of the 11 were confirmed. 2 were missing. Alexei, and one daughter. For 16 years after the 1991 identification, the question of the two missing Romanovs remained officially unresolved. The rumors that one of the girls had survived, that Anastasia was still alive somewhere, had circulated for decades. The second discovery in 2007 ended them permanently. In July 2007, Russian archaeologists working near the original burial site found a second pit. Inside, fragments of bone, fragments of ceramic containers that had held sulfuric acid, and remnants of a fire. DNA analysis confirmed the remains as Alexei and Maria. Yurovsky had burned two of the bodies separately and buried them 70 meters from the others. The gap was intentional. It had taken 89 years to close it. The 2007 discovery ended definitively any possibility that a Romanov child had survived. Every major claimant, including Anna Anderson, whose claim to be Anastasia had occupied courts and newspapers for decades, had already been disproved by DNA evidence from the 1991 analysis. The 2007 find confirmed that all 5 children were accounted for. What it also confirmed, quietly, was the accuracy of the Sokolov investigation from 1919. The investigator the Soviet state had dismissed as a White Army propagandist had documented the burial sites, the acid, the fire, and the separation of the bodies with remarkable precision. The Soviet Union spent 70 years calling him a liar. The bones proved he wasn't. Yurovsky died in 1938, having never faced any legal accountability for what happened in that cellar. The Ipatiev House was demolished in 1977 on the order of a regional Communist Party official named Boris Yeltsin, then following instructions from Moscow, who feared it would become a site of pilgrimage. It did, anyway. The church on the Blood was built on the same ground in 2003. Alexander of Donin, the geologist who found the first burial site and reburied the remains and waited 13 years in silence, lived to see the full identification completed. Eugene Botkin's children spent decades petitioning for his recognition. In 2016, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized him as a saint. The family he refused to leave had been canonized in 2000. He made it, in the end, just 16 years late. The Soviet state burned the bodies, dissolved them in acid, buried them in 2 separate locations, and spent 73 years denying what had happened. The teeth survived. The records survived. The truth, apparently, is harder to dissolve than bone. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to let me know in the comments.